one of the things I was compelled by as I've been reading your confidential work, not for publication yet. And one thing I zeroed in on, and particularly with the title, was this notion of advancing work regardless of where you sit, right? And for me, this was both nature and nurture, meaning that when I was young, I didn't just teach to stuffed animals in my room. I organized armies or, had Marvel men and scenarios or situations. So when I became a student, it was very normal and natural for me to advocate for myself, whether it was student council leadership or athletics. It was just natural. And so when I got my first role as a teacher, extremely natural for me to say, here's what I think we should do better, and to advocate for myself and to raise those questions. But as you know, that is not the norm. And across many organizations, whether it's a culture of fear, a culture of control, people have very legitimate concerns about raising issues or raising solutions. So I tell this story where one of my first posts was under a very strong leader who kind of ran a tight ship, and there wasn't a lot of room for people like me. And so what I did is I got on their calendar every Friday as an assistant principal, and I said, hey, I just need 20 minutes. I'm going to run the data by you, the money and the solution. And I've got 3 things I'd like to do. And they'd slap my hand on 2 and they'd say, Bryan, you can do that one. And boy, would I jump into that and lead it. And that's how I began to advocate, even in a culture that was different than ones that I would lead moving forward. So we got a lot of listeners out there. And to frame all that in a question, it's like, how do people balance asking the questions, advancing the work, when they may be in different types of environments and with leaders that don't mimic some of the environments we've been privileged to be in?
Yeah. Well, obviously this is something I'm pretty passionate about, right? I mean, so I'll be very careful in terms of not consuming too much time here, but I'm at every sort of level that I've worked at, state, local, and national. It's just been a real passion of mine to support folks in being able to advance work and moving things forward. And I find that really, regardless of what those levels, the choke points are pretty much the same, right? The actors are different, maybe the content is different, but the choke points are pretty similar. And, it really doesn't matter how good the idea is if you can't move it forward, right? So that's my concern. I think those who are closest to the work often have the best ideas, and a lot of those ideas have sort of never seen the light of day because maybe they're not real sure how to move it forward. So there are a few things that I talk about when I coach teams, and some of the things that we're writing about these days. And one of those, and I hope this resonates with your listeners, but this notion of focus on advancing the work, right? Sometimes I think if we've got this great idea, we're passionate about it, we believe it'll work, we've got maybe even some evidence that it'll work, right, in our sort of unit of analysis. But sometimes if that idea isn't sort of accepted or implemented in the way that we think it ought to be, or if it's not accepted at all, sometimes we can think, everything's lost, but it's really not. I would encourage folks to focus on advancing the work. It's that notion that I was taught, and maybe you were too, of leave it better than you found it, right? So maybe you get to where you envisioned you would get, maybe you don't, but leave it better than you found it. And that's why I talk about the notion of sort of advancing the work, and that advancement is really the goal, and attainment is really a bonus, right? So that's one thing, and I think that's helped me a lot move work forward, understanding that it probably was going to look different after it left my hands, and frankly, in most cases, when it looked different, it was better because of that collaborative process, that good give and take between everybody who has a stake in what we're doing. And the second thing I talk about with teams and individuals is it's also really important that we understand what the priorities of the system leader are. And this is true everywhere in every system, but I think it becomes particularly true, at least in my experience in government or other bureaucratic settings, to recognize that a lot of leaders, especially in political sort of situations or appointed situations, a lot of leaders have a particular set of priorities that they're charged to deliver on, and they will often have kind of a specified limited window of time to deliver on those. So when presenting an idea to someone in that setting, it's really important to understand what they've got to spend the majority of their time on, because that means that most things, even good things, are naturally going to fall outside of the parameters of that. And it's really important then that I share an idea or an opportunity in a way that the leader perceives it as something that moves their work forward. So I think that's really important. Real quickly, I'll mention the last few, if I may. And the next one is I've got to manage my assumptions.
Yep.
Because a lot of times we'll come to a system leader or team leader and share an idea that we think they ought to do because it's the, quote, right thing to do. And as well intended as that is, I think it's a bit presumptuous. I don't think it's very strategic, and my experience has been it's probably not going to be real productive. So if we recognize that they've got this particular agenda and window of time, then I think we've got to have a more strategic approach than you ought to do this because it's the right thing to do. And most system leaders probably have heard a few other right things to do today, this month, and a whole bunch this year. So the next thing, I think when we keep those things in mind, we can really plan an approach that has really an increased potential to be successful. And I always say two things, it's one thing what my perception of the idea is. That matters. Right. The folks I represent, the constituency, their perception of the idea matters. But when we're sharing an idea with a decision maker and a system leader, then it's very important that that system leader perceives that to do a couple of things. So number one, I think the system leader has to perceive that this notion you're positing will help them move their work forward or in some way answer some pervasive problem. And what I would say is that's not the leader's job to figure out. Right. That's your job and my job, right? All right. So the second thing that I think, in addition to that the leader has to perceive about your idea for improvement or innovation is I've got to make a calculation as a system leader. I may think this is a great idea. I may want to do it, but is it doable within the time frame I have to lead? And is it worth the capital that I'm going to have to spend to get it done? And those calculations are not personal about you or about the particular thing you're asking to do. They're just realities that system leaders have to deal with. It's the calculus of system leaders, right? Every day we're choosing among competing priorities. And so then the very last thing, I think it's real important, as you and I have talked about before, that you leave system leaders with something they can use. All those leave behind materials are so important. Yep. And I remember in senior leadership roles, often I would read those, sometimes even if I didn't have time and I was compelled by the idea, I would charge my staff to read them and brief me about them, right? So those leave behinds are really important. But whatever it is and how extensive it is, let's think about how we leave system leaders with something they can use, something they can easily understand, something they can easily communicate, and then strategically something that you can reference back to and an opportunity for follow-up that hopefully would come. But anyway, I'm really passionate about just resourcing folks and helping them do what I have found to be what I call a pervasive and universal choke point across any level I've ever seen in any system I've ever seen. And that is, how do we effectively engage and communicate with system leaders?